incredibly wide vision to transform not just bridges and sea tolls and stadia and high-speed rail, but more importantly, to revolutionize the opportunities for billions of people who live in the region that we represent. And I'm not talking only about Asia Pacific, I'm talking about the Islamic communities that of course are dotted in every single part of the world. So of course today we're joined by a highly distinguished panel. Each of them brings a message which is completely unique, and I'm going to tap into that over the next 40 or so minutes and also try to link up with everybody here in the audience. I know that many of them want to hear some of the pragmatic advice they can have on funding in their projects. So we're joined by a number of people. Quick reminder, we've got Bakti Santoso Luddin, who's the President Commissioner of Wijaya, which is one of Indonesia's biggest construction companies. We also have Luky Eko Wuryanto. He's the Vice President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and he was previously a Deputy Minister here in Indonesia. Also Ahmad Zulqarnain Onn, who is the Executive Director over at Khazanah, and Dato Muzaffar Hisham, who's the Group Head of Global Banking over at Maybank. Dato, why don't we just begin with you? Randomly, tell me about some of the infrastructure projects that you're thinking about right now as we move into the future. And we ask you to keep it to about a minute, please.
Thank you very much, James, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Basically, for Maybank, our focus has always been in ASEAN. Over the past decade or so, our focus has always been the growth of the infrastructure out of Malaysia. Of course, now the key growth is also in Indonesia. We've looked at quite a few power plants and also road infrastructure and also ports, not only in this Indonesia, but also across ASEAN. So we're very active in this part of the space. But without a doubt, as James has mentioned, there are a few challenges, and we hope this afternoon we could have that great conversation along. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let's jump to Zul, who is sitting next to me from Khazanah. You bring a wealth of experience from private sector. You've been with Khazanah for the last 2 years. Tell me about some of the areas of focus that Khazanah is moving on right now.
Thanks, James. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Khazanah, as you know, is the strategic investment arm of the Malaysian government, and one of the core areas of investments for us historically has always been in infrastructure projects. So the genesis of Khazanah was always that we started off with a collection of effectively what were state-owned enterprises, and historically infrastructure was always delivered by the state as opposed to by private companies. And by virtue of that, today we are shareholders or owners in a large collection of infrastructure assets in Malaysia, including the main artery running north to south, called the North-South Highway, the airport, all of the airports barring one in Malaysia, the National Electricity Company, the National Telecommunications Company. So what we've tried to do over the past 12 years is really take our experience in owning and being investors in infrastructure and try to deploy that elsewhere. And we have, I think, been reasonably successful. So I think I hope to bring from a perspective of an owner or an investor in infrastructure assets to the panel today.
Thank you. Let's move now to Bakti, who is the before Bakti, let's go to Luky, who is the Vice President at the AIIB. And I want to come to you specifically before we move on to one of the key actors in terms of engineering contractors. And I want to ask you, is there actually a funding gap? Because the title of this session is How to Finance the Infrastructure Financing Gap, but I want to actually turn that around and first of all take that assumption out. Is there a gap? Is it a mismatch instead?
Okay, that's a very good question. Okay, obviously there has been a lot of data mentioning about the demand for infrastructure. You name it, maybe every country could have that kinds of data. Even in the global scale, we have a lot of information related with those data. It mentions over here that in 2014 even stated that the needs for infrastructure is around $60 trillion for the next 17 years old, from 2013 to 2030. Asia, it also mentioned that it needs around 8 to 9 trillion US dollars, up from 2010 to 2020. These are all some of the studies that I just quote, and you can probably with your math, simple math, we could say that globally we need 3.2 to 3.4 trillion per year infrastructure. Asia, 0.8 trillion per year. So it's really huge needs. But may I say that those kinds of data are in fact only more on the demand side. So it was usually extracted from the number of the GDP, and then we associate it with what would be the percentage for the infrastructure investments with the amounts of the GDP. But if we take a look more closely, I mean, it is a huge demand, but then from the supply side, not really have a data that is really comprehensive, saying that these are the projects that need data. Those are, in Malaysia, there are maybe, I don't know, 10 projects, or Indonesia maybe 50 projects that needs, speak in what kinds of data that they are need for infrastructure development. That maybe also make the project is also interested for the bank, for the other institutions to also invest over there. So that's kind of a mismatch that I think. So that I think it's happening right now. A lot of demands, but there is also a lot of potential on the other sides of the financial, that from pension funds, from sukuk right now, that is really also being so many potential. But these two sectors is actually not met. So okay, it's not a simple gap, but we have to basically meet these two actors together to make the financial for the infrastructure to be financed.
Great. So you've mentioned sukuk and you've also mentioned pension fund.
Yeah.
Let's leave it aside because I want you to go into detail, all of you, and break that down for us. Turning to beside you, to Bakti, as we said, Wijaya is one of the biggest players in infrastructure, both as a contractor but also as an investor in major projects. Right now, you are handling the high-speed rail project with China. You're also investing in the MRT and also in the sea tolls. Tell me first, though, about this, because I know you've got lots of grievances. You can get it all out with all the bankers here in the room, and don't hold back. First thing, interest rates here in Indonesia are very high. It can be as high as 8-9%, which is 2 times, 3 times as high in other parts of the world. Is this going to be the big barrier, first of all, for you as you begin to build? How can you build at such an expensive rate?
Yeah, that's the challenge, yeah. Thank you, James. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So basically, as a player, we are facing the difficulties or the constraint, we call it, about the financing of this infrastructure project, because the preparation for the getting the contract for the infrastructure project is usually quite short time. Especially in Indonesia, you know, we are tied into the government budget, which is annual. And for example, for the toll road, right? As soon as we get a contract, then we have to prepare the financing for that. And so the fastest way to get financing for that will be a short-term financing, right? And this is not right, because the short-term financing is not supposed to finance the long-term, you know, projects. But we don't have any choice, you know, because we have to start working on the projects, otherwise we get delayed, and, you know, there are so many other problems related with that. So basically, I'm glad I can speak here, you know, because now I can bring up this issue to the other speaker here that maybe can help us, you know, because basically this short-term, you know, finance needs to be replaced with the long-term finance to finance the long-term investment, right? So that's basically the main issue, James. I'm glad you bring this up, you know. So I'm glad to sit here with Pak Luky and But Zul here, so maybe they can help us, to overcome
I
this
think get
problem.
ready with your checkbooks. A request is going to come at lunchtime. Why don't we start? You look a little bit nervous. We'll start with you then. Zul, tell me, short-term financing, obviously when they build, they need that support right away. I think Bakti has thrown down a gauntlet, a challenge to all of you, but in a constructive way. How can he help you help him?
I think that one of the things that tends to be overlooked when we talk about infrastructure and building out infrastructure in any markets is really the financing for it. The nature of infrastructure assets is such that these are very long-term assets that take a long time to pay back, especially when you're doing it through a public-private partnership type of structure. And as we go forward, what we think we're going to experience is also as infrastructure projects become more complex, for example, infrastructure projects that are principally just intra-urban, could be an MRT, could be an elevated highway, the costs of such infrastructure is also going to be a lot more expensive. Right? It's easier to build a road, a 100-kilometer road across less densely populated areas than it is trying to build a 3-kilometer road in a city such as Jakarta. And what we see is that the tenure that is required to pay back for such infrastructure is increasing. Right? So we've started off with where projects where you can pay it back in 5 years, in 7 years, in 10 years. Now we're beginning to see projects where it's going to take 30 or even 40 years to pay back. So for a lot of governments and policymakers, my view is that you have to put a lot of focus on how these projects are going to be funded. And it's a very complex issue. But at the core of it, if I can just kind of simplify it, is that there needs to be a large pool of long-term savings that are available in any economy.
Okay, can I ask you to take that to one step higher, and maybe you can answer that question you put out there. Give me one idea in terms of how to finance, and then we can take another idea from Dato next.
The core ingredient is you need a very deep and long-term capital market, right? So you need to be able to issue a paper, be it a sukuk or a bond, that closely matches the tenure of the project, right? So once you build a road, it's going to be good for 40, 50 years, right? So there are two benefits. One is if you can issue paper that's sort of 20 to 30 years, then for someone like Bakti, he has quick access to financing by tapping the capital markets. But secondly, for the public at large, because you don't have to pay back for the project so quickly, the concession terms can be much more favorable. So instead of the toll being, say, $1 US, it could be 60 US cents. So the public is usually much more sensitive when in terms of the outlay today as opposed to how long they need to pay for it. I think just politically it's easier for policymakers and for consumers to accept paying for over a period of 20 years a smaller amount than doubling or triple that amount but paying it just over say 5 or 7 years. So developing that part of the capital market is really critical to be able to have a successful infrastructure program.
Okay, we'll put that to Bakti in just a minute and see what he thinks about the viability of each of these suggestions. Let's go to Dato. Can we have an idea from you that perhaps we haven't heard yet?
First and foremost, thank you, Pak Bakti. Definitely, I'm going to ask my colleagues from Maybank Indonesia to put a pitch to PT Wijaya. I'm surprised they haven't meet you up as well. No, sir, thank you. I think Pak Bakti raised a fundamental question. The banks can provide the bridger on the short term. That's quite an easy, straightforward part on the bridging part. But as we all know, if we look back at history in the 97 and 98 financial crisis, the thing that got us into trouble was because of the short-term financing to these long-term projects, particularly not only just in Indonesia, but in Malaysia as well, and other parts of ASEAN. I'm a true advocate of on market efficiency. And when we look at market efficiency, and Zol has raised a very good point on the deepening of the capital market, and the three parts that we need to be mindful about when we look at market efficiency is number one, of course, managing risk, number two, on transparency, and number three, on tradability. Now, these three components, if the regulators, the players, always refine and retool it, would able to promote a better rated sort of type of securities, more to match for the long-term financing. Because, as rightly mentioned by Pak Luky, there's a lot of players involved, not just the banks, but insurance companies, pension funds, of course AIIB, which do have appetite for long-term. And for banks, we like to trade as well for the securities as well. So this deepening of the debt market or the securities market, both the debt and the equity side, would create that vibrancy to allow this mismatching of the long-term funding needs. Of course, there's a lot more factors to it, but I just want to put that into notion, the focus on how do we create that market efficiency in this region particularly. Thank you.
And I think you just agreed to maybe fund some of Bakti's projects in future, right?
Most definitely.
You've got it.
We'll put a pitch book there, Pak.
You've got it on recording now. Okay, so let's go now to AIIB, and I want to ask Pak Luky about this specifically, because a lot of people, fairly or unfairly, are looking towards the AIIB as a savior, perhaps, or even as a magic bullet solution for some of the funding gaps that we're seeing. I know you're looking very nervous and you're smiling to yourself. But I come to you last not only because of that, but Luky, you were a Deputy Minister for Infrastructure beforehand. You're an economist. You have a very wide vision of the world in which we live and how it changes. I mean, you even take the underground to and from work in Beijing every day, simply because the infrastructure there can't support millions of people on the roads every morning and every night. These problems are universal. It's not limited to just China or Asia. Yeah. But where do you find some solutions, and where do you identify them as being at?
Okay, maybe before I answer your question directly, let me put some ground first. That I guess the mismatch is actually happening because on one side, not really understands about what's actually the nature or the characteristics of the infrastructure project, especially from the banking sector. That even though they are maybe feel interested or something, but since many of the resource that they have is basically a short term, so it's really a difficulty for them to just directly finance. And so to understand the characteristics of the infrastructure project, especially for the private investor, is basically the task of the government. So it's in fact that it's government who is responsible for the development of the infrastructure. So they are the one who then should socialize, should say more, a lot, on how should we finance the infrastructure if the government money is actually limited. So they have to basically say about that, but not only say, they have to also develop certain regulations, certain incentive on how the other institutions could invest. When I talk about the pension fund that I stated before, I mean, it has been already an opportunity for the pension fund to invest on the infrastructure, but is it really then the managers or even the commissioners are really inclined to do that? Because if they are talking about the infrastructure, then it means they have to invest on some bond or something like that. And the bonds in itself could be zero coupon bond that maybe will get the money 20 years or even more than that, while their term is only like 5 years. So it means within 5 years they don't have anything if they invest on that. So these kinds of things that have to be, we have to find, or the government should find some solution on how they're interested on doing that. Also with the sukuk and so on and so forth. So I guess this is actually not only the problems of Indonesia or even the problem of China, but with the situations that the demand for infrastructure is so huge, I guess we have to find another instrument for the other institution to be able to participate on the infrastructure development. I'm actually sitting back before these sessions, and I'm really interested to see all of the discussions. And please also that we have to also include the infrastructure over here with the virtual infrastructure, which is in fact the things that could support the ID's development, something like that. So in my my institutions on the AIIB, the two prioritized infrastructure that will be built right now is one, is obviously the transportations, because we would like to promote connectivity among the countries in Asia. And the two is actually energy, whereby that I guess our own country, my own country, Indonesia, is really having a lot of demand on that. And with the energy, we could in fact do a lot of things with the ID and others, and makes people basically have a new opportunity on improving their quality of life.
Okay, let's throw it back now to Bakti. You've heard a number of ideas. First of all, react to that, please, for us very quickly.
Okay.
And secondly, I'm sure that you may have an idea of your own to put to these banks, to put to these institutions that maybe they haven't thought about before yet.
Yeah, I think I would like to go back to basic, I think, where, of course, this financial institution, if they would like to provide the financing for the infrastructure projects, they have to make sure, they have to be certain that the company that they are trying to help is also in a good condition, yeah? So I just want to make a little bit of promotion of my Wijaya Karya here, that basically we are a state-owned company, 65% owned by the government, and then we are 35% owned by public. So we are very transparent company, and we have a very good average growth rate for our sales, for our profit for the last 5 years, and we have a good cash flow situation also. So I think we are ready. We are ready to do good work, and so far our reputation on the construction work here and also abroad, yeah, not only here. We have done 120 kilometers of highway, quality project in Algeria in 2009 with the Japanese consortium there. So we are very confident that we can do the construction work, properly and satisfactorily. So, but now we are facing this constraint that I told you, that basically when we have to start the construction work, we don't have the long-term financing ready yet, because to arrange a long-term financing, you need some times and also so many others requirement. So the only way to do it, we have to use our short-term financing, available to us. And as you mentioned earlier, especially in Indonesia, the interest rate is very high. So we are trying to be creative also to work with the countries which has no interest. For example, like Japan, right? Even I heard in Japan, if you put money in the bank, then you have to pay, rather than bank give you the interest to you, like here in Indonesia, right? So that's what we did, we tried to, make the connection with those institutions in Japan, and also the scheme, the scheme of the infrastructure project itself, the recent PPP, the public-private partnership scheme that we just formed and done with the China Railway to build the high-speed railway from Jakarta to Bandung, which is about 150 kilometers. It's a huge infrastructure project here. It's about $5 billion US projects, And this is a B2B. There is no government guarantee, and This is consortium between the Indonesian state-owned companies and the China Railway Consortium also. 60% owned by the Indonesian consortium and 40% owned by the China Railway Consortium. And we got the promised financing from CDB. Of course, you know, we are still doing the preparation for that. While we do the arrangement of this long-term financing, we now doing the front-end engineering design, and hopefully in the near future it will be done. And yeah, we need the financing for this project also. So I mean, I just want to, you know, tell about this.
Well, I don't want to become a disjointed conversation where the needs of one don't match with the needs and demands of the other. Zul, perhaps you can respond quickly and tie this up for us. Obviously, we know the complexities involved where short-term financing is being used to stave off long-term financing, but Bakti has also talked about the complexities of raising in time for long-term financing as well. Is there a simpler approach ahead? Is there an out-of-the-box thinking or school of thought which we haven't yet tapped into, which may not quite make sense now, but anticipating in 2-3 years' time could do?
I wouldn't call it out of the box. I think what is required is really a lot of more of an innovation mindset amongst and collaboration amongst providers of capital, those that need the capital, and very critically those that set policy. Because the latent demand and need for infrastructure is real. The demand and need for financing for infrastructure is very real. We are very fortunate to live in a part of the world where savings rates tends to be quite high, right? I think in Indonesia, savings to GDP is, I think, if not 40, close to 40%. And in most Asian economies, most Asian markets, savings rates tends to be quite high. So you really have already the ingredients, and the last one being that we generally have a very young demographic as well, that is becoming more affluent, will live longer, and therefore need to save for retirement coming up in 40 or 50 years' time. So you really do have all the required ingredients to have a very nice environment for financing of infrastructure, right? Take anything of that away, take away the savings rates. If you don't have savings, you can't fund infrastructure. It's very simple. This is mathematical relationship. So when I talk about an innovation mindset, is that you really need people to get together and say, and to take the words from Azran, CEO of iFlix earlier, you really need to just sit down in a room and just hack away at what are all the pain points that is preventing what is already a large pool of savings from going to funding long-term infrastructure projects. Different markets will have different pain points. It could be taxation, it could be stamp duty, punitive stamp duties, it could be laws that are unequal, it could be disincentives, unintended disincentives in existing policy or regulations that prevent, say, pension companies or provident funds from investing in long-term paper. But it's really, I think, not that difficult just to get together and identify all the pain points and have a policy response to eliminate those pain points.
You brought up a very interesting facet of the conversation which we haven't quite yet delved into, and you mentioned the younger demographic that needs to better plan and better prepare for their financial futures, for their lives. And it reminds me that perhaps none of us in this room will be sticking around long enough to see some of the fruition of some of the major infrastructure projects being developed in the world today. It reminds me also, I think, that between the 4 speakers, you have 12 children between you. You're building for them, you're building for their friends, you're building for our communities. Do you think that we're building and investing in the right projects? And do you think there is a project yet which we are still missing out? Is Khazanah, for example, or is Maybank, for example, AIIB, is there a project yet that's so compelling and so exciting that it makes you sit up and say, I want to fund that? You don't need to sell it to me. I want that.
I think so. I think infrastructure projects have tended to be in country, right? I think as ASEAN becomes more integrated, perhaps there is room for infrastructure projects to be across multiple countries. I think the first one will probably be starting soon, if it does happen, when it does happen, which is the high-speed rail between Malaysia and Singapore. Right, the complexity of trying to do something dealing with two governments is of course difficult. Anything more than that, it becomes exponentially more difficult. But some of the ideas that have been thrown about is, for example, why don't we have an ASEAN grid for power, so that where there is excess power in one country, you can export that to another country quite easily. And I think that brings down the cost, the overall cost of providing either electricity or rail services or even road services. So that's probably something that, just thinking ahead 10, 15 years, maybe something that we should be aiming for.
What do you think, Dato? Do you think it must be trans-border? Do you see it in the framework, for example, of ASEAN? Would you even take it further? Something which is more in line with One Belt, One Road, the dozens of countries that would be linked up not only by the routes that were charted out by the Silk Road, but also by the maritime routes that could come of that links even to Oceania, even to East Africa.
Well, I don't want to go into what type of projects is appropriate and so forth. That's, in a way, the role of the policymakers. If you bet on the project which is not right, you don't get elected the next round. So it's quite straightforward in that sense. So it's some big decisions by these policymakers to make. But I would like to touch on, it's very interesting that you mentioned about the future of our children. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the future of our children and we talk about infrastructure, we had a conversation about interest rates and so forth. When we talk about infrastructure investments, we also need to take a look at the policies of the various countries. It's in parallel because the government balance sheet must be also strong. And the two parts that I'm quite passionate about, and when we discuss about with policymakers and decision makers in any country, the two big topic, despite it may not be directly involved with infrastructure, is the number one is on any government's fiscal discipline, because once you have a fiscal discipline, you have that balance sheet to support and complement with the private sector on various projects. And the other one is investing in our future, as our children, is on education. Yeah, you might be saying, well, we talk about infrastructure and we talk about education. Because when you invest in education, that's where you invest on the higher middle income folks eventually. And when we talk about middle income, you increase on your saving rates and so on and so forth. Sometimes I do look at some statistics in ASEAN, and I don't want to mention any country specifically. Certain urban education rate is very alarming in the sense that I notice certain countries, 20% of, on average in certain urban areas, have not completed what we call the basic tertiary education. That means up to the high school part. That means automatically about 20% in urban areas that some countries, you have a gap of folks are not able to increase that role of a middle income in that sense. Now that can be quite alarming and that can be quite dangerous because that's where the future for investments of the high saving rates that Asia has always been enjoyable about. So when we talk about infrastructure, policymakers got to be mindful about this discipline because it's not just based on the market. The government policies plays a big important role. Fiscal discipline and investing in our education as well.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, you've widened the conversation. It reminded me of what the president said yesterday about a focus on micro companies, on SMEs as well as being critical to the success of the overall economy. And I think also with Prime Minister Najib, who talked about education and poverty being the ongoing barriers to women in countries everywhere, but also to people everywhere on top of that. Let's move that then to, but Luky, you're hearing all these different strains of conversations, and they're fascinating, each and every one of them. I know that you have some of your own.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, James. Let me cite you some numbers, especially related with the pension fund that has been invested in infrastructure projects. We're talking the global number. In 2014, 42.9 billion US dollars has been invested in infrastructure. So some of those financial institutions knows that some infrastructure is really good, and they probably have their own analysis on coming to that investments. So 42.9 billion US dollars. That is in 2014 alone. The size or the potentials of the pension fund globally in the same year is 38 trillion US dollars. So it's pretty big. I mean, there's a lot of money that I don't know, maybe it's only if you compare the 42.9 to 38.0 trillion, it's only like fraction percentage that they are in fact invest in infrastructure. So there should be more that they could invest over there. But then again, needs a lot of incentive, needs a lot of synchronizations of the policy that should be done by the government. And maybe some of the MDBs could also educate the government on doing that. And related with the infrastructure itself, there are 2 points that I would like to raise. First is that, please understand that there are 2 parts of investment in infrastructure. First is on the constructions, which is high risk, very large investments. And maybe, yeah, I mean, not a lot of people actually, in fact, a lot of institutions are, in fact, could be able to invest by themselves, or even some group of the investor on doing that. But that on the operations, that comes that really interesting one, because on the operations, the leverage of the infrastructure investment is very even higher. Many of them are even higher with the other sectors. So, and the risk is very low, because you know the infrastructure projects tend to be really high, long-term, and then really having a benefit for the economic-wide activities. So maybe the investor are more interesting on the operation part of the investments rather than on the construction side part. So that the government should probably give more attention on how to basically reduce the risk of the investments of the infrastructure during the construction side. So there's been a lot of, I guess, policies has been established by the government of Indonesia, for example. But then again, I guess needs a sit down from the related institutions on how to implement, how to make the project basically bankable. Of course, that at the end of the day, we have to come to that so that investors are in fact interested on doing that. Last point is, please understand that don't have the view that the infrastructure is competing with the poverty. I guess that is very important. And I guess if I know this is only my understanding, the poverty programs or poverty alleviations that mainly, or some of them are also related with educations. Some of them are related also with health. And even bigger chunk of them are related with the building very localized infrastructure at the village level, at the community level. So in fact, the way I see it, once the government do the poverty alleviations, once they got improved on the education, on the health, on the local infrastructure, what do we do? They have to improve their quality of life by building a larger infrastructure. How them to then to connect with the other communities to sell their goods, to sell their commodities, to make obviously a greater opportunity for their economic or quality of life or the economic status or something like that. So that things that I guess we should come together, or we should have more communications, especially between the government and the investor, on how to then make the investor itself getting more and more participate on the infrastructure development. Thank you.
I was wondering, Zul or Dato or Bakti, do you agree with that we shouldn't look to the providers to pitch projects within the framework of poverty programs and poverty alleviation. I mean, surely, if it's not strictly poverty, surely infrastructure is there to transform our opportunities in some ways.
Well, I think the key word here is connectivity, right? What Pak Luky just mentioned, not to competing between the poverty alleviation and the infrastructure. I think it won't. I mean, because I think if you have the good infrastructure, you especially in the increasing the connectivity between peoples, then the potential, the economic growth is also improved, yeah, and by having this improvement, all those that Pak Dato mentioned about the education and economic growth, and also the people development, yeah, I mean SMEs and those kind of things will be also increased, will be improved. So I think that's my point. My point will be, I totally agree that the infrastructure, especially improving the connectivity, will also improve the growth of the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I don't think infrastructure competes with poverty alleviation. I think it complements it. However, governments only have one budget, and there's always competing demands for out of that budget, and that's where public-private partnerships become more and more important as governments around the world try to manage their own treasuries more efficiently. I take note, and I like the point that Dato Muzaffar made, that education is part of infrastructure as well, right? And one of the things that's interesting, I think, going forward is that how do you fund, if you accept that education is part of infrastructure, how do you fund public education using the same techniques as what we've done in funding hard infrastructure? One of the things that Khazanah has experimented it with, I think we started this last year, was the concept of a socially responsible instrument, where we raised 100 million ringgit through the issuance of a sukuk that is dedicated to the funding of certain public schools in Malaysia, what we call trust schools. These are public schools owned by the government that have some certain special programs that are running through to improve the quality of education that's coming out of those schools. The unique thing about this particular instrument is that I don't remember the exact numbers, but as you know, each sukuk has a profit rate, call it 5%. If the schools after 5 years deliver on certain of the KPIs, the key performance indicators that were set up front, investors then have the option of reducing or even eliminating the profit rate that was promised, the 5% that was promised up front. So there's quite an interesting innovation. It actually won quite a lot of awards, capital market awards. It's going to take another 4 years to figure out how effective it has been, but certainly it's something that's very different and does introduce a little bit of flavor to how we fund infrastructure.
Okay, let's wrap up like this. A challenge for each of you, going ahead, leaving this room, going back to our communities, returning to our projects in whatever capacity we are in. We live in a world where conditions have shifted considerably even within the last months. We've had Brexit, we've had the impact beginning to be felt in the EU. We have a ramification potentially globally speaking. We have terrorism-related challenges. We've got Islamophobia, for example. When you put all that together, what's the one message you want everyone to take away with them as they leave here today? And we'll go in the order from nearest to me, and we'll finish off with Dato. So we'll go and start off with Zul. One idea in 1 or 2 sentences.
I guess my message would be that it's important to remember that all of the markets around this region have the necessary ingredients for successful financing of infrastructure. There's a huge need for infrastructure, there's a huge pool of savings. You've just got to knock out all those hurdles and pain points, and policymakers play the largest role in this to make sure that the capital markets work and there's matching of what is an innate desire for long-term savings which can be used to fund long-term infrastructure.
Bakti?
Yeah. The potential is there, like Zul mentioned, the pension fund, as mentioned by Luky also, is big, yeah? And also the need for the infrastructure is big. Now it's a matter of how these two can be connected in a harmonious way, supporting each other and, mutual benefit for each other. And, I think this will make the solution for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, my take is basically that we should be fortunate ourselves, especially the one who living in Asia regions, because us is in fact become, or now is being, you could say, globally center of gravity of the economic developments. Take a look at the problems that the other regions has it right now. So I guess investing in a lot of infrastructure is obviously will make even better our situations in the regions. And for our colleague also in the Islamic world, I guess the idea are still the same. I mean, basically with a lot of faster infrastructure developments, a lot of things could be done. I mean, information could be flown very freely, and a lot of people will be lifting out of the poverty. So that hopefully will improve the situations in many fronts. That's my idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to comment on Pak Luky earlier about the increasing poverty. If I'm a politician, I want to use that soundbite. I mean, infrastructure, increasing poverty. I mean, so definitely, I'm not going to use that if you're the policymaker. I think the greatest opportunity, and we haven't spent time talking about this, on Islamic finance. And one of the areas of infrastructure financing that I think I'm looking forward to, this is definitely going to be an hour conversation, but the evolution of the credit intermediary to become investment intermediary. We're seeing pockets of improvement for banks and Islamic banking in finance in the concept of mudarabah, which is investment intermediary. I'm looking forward for that development. I think central banks are embracing that. There's a lot of opportunity for us to address some of the challenges that we have achieved that. So the evolution of credit intermediary to investment intermediary, that's one space. I truly encourage everyone here to watch that space because there's a great opportunity there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Muzaffar, to Zul, to Pak Luky, and to Pak Bakti. Thank you very much, and to everybody here. I think we only ran over about 4 or 5 minutes over time, so your lunch hour is fully yours now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.